Professor Velcron adjusted his crystalline throat sac and gazed out at the assembled crowd with the kind of smugness that only comes from having 3 doctoral degrees and absolutely zero self-awareness. The amphitheater of the Galactic Academy's Xenopsychology department was packed tighter than a transport shuttle during migration season, with representatives from 47 different species, all eager to hear the renowned expert explain why some civilizations were clearly more evolved than others. Welcome, colleagues, to today's symposium on primitive fear responses in lesser developed species, Velcron announced, his voice carrying that particular brand of academic condescension that could make paint peel. His 6 eyes swept across the audience, lingering appreciatively on the nodding heads of his fellow professors. Today we shall examine how crude fight-or-flight mechanisms demonstrate the vast intellectual gulf between advanced civilizations such as ours, and those still shackled by their barbaric evolutionary programming. In the back row, slouched so far down in his chair that he was practically horizontal, sat Jake Martinez, the only human in a sea of tentacles, scales, and various appendages that defied classification. He had the look of someone who'd rather be literally anywhere else, including possibly a black hole. His fingers drummed against his tablet as Velcron droned on about emotional primitiveness and biological inadequacy. Take, for instance, the fear response, Velcron continued, clicking his mandibles in what passed for enthusiasm among his species. When faced with danger, lesser beings resort to crude chemical floods. Adrenaline, cortisol, panic. Meanwhile, we advanced species have evolved beyond such messy biological reactions. We respond to threats with calculated logic and superior reasoning. A Zephyrian in the 3rd row raised what might have been a hand, or possibly a sensory organ. Professor, surely you're not suggesting that all emotional responses are primitive? Oh, but I am, dear Quillax, Velcron replied with obvious delight. Consider the human species, for example. Several beings in the audience actually turned to look at Jake, who had now progressed to examining his fingernails with the intensity of an archaeologist discovering a new tomb. Humans are absolutely notorious for their fear-based decision-making. Their entire civilization is built around avoiding things that make them uncomfortable. They even invented something called horror entertainment, where they deliberately frighten themselves for pleasure. Clearly, this demonstrates a species so dominated by fear that they've made it recreational. The audience rippled with what passed for laughter among 47 different species, creating a sound like a cosmic wind chime having an argument with a garbage disposal. Jake finally looked up from his fingernails, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something that might have made Professor Velcron reconsider his lecture topic, if he'd been paying attention instead of basking in his own intellectual superiority. Furthermore, Velcron continued, warming to his theme like a politician at a fundraiser, humans have this particularly amusing tendency to anthropomorphize their fears. They create elaborate mythologies around darkness, unknown sounds, and isolation. It's quite touching, really, how they need to create stories to cope with basic survival instincts that we've simply evolved beyond. That's when Jake's hand went up. Not dramatically. Not with any particular urgency, just a casual, almost lazy gesture that somehow managed to cut through Velcron's pontificating, like a hot knife through butter made of pure smugness. Yes, Velcron asked, blinking all 6 eyes in sequence. The human has a question. Jake stretched, making a sound that was part yawn, part sigh, and entirely calculated to annoy. Not really a question, Professor. More like an offer. An offer? Yeah. Jake sat up slightly, which for him was basically the equivalent of standing at attention. You're talking about human fear responses, right? How primitive and crude they are? Indeed, that is the subject of today's lecture. Well, Jake said, and now there was definitely something in his voice that hadn't been there before, something that made the crystalline near the front row unconsciously adjust their refractive indices. Want me to show you? The amphitheater went dead quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get when everyone's listening intently, but the kind of quiet you get when everyone's trying to figure out if they just heard what they thought they heard. Velcron's throat sac pulsed twice, which was either excitement or indigestion. Show us what, exactly? A human fear response demonstration. For educational purposes, of course. Jake's smile was the kind of smile that probably looked perfectly innocent to anyone who'd never seen a human before. I mean, if you're going to lecture about it, shouldn't your students get to see it in action? Very hands-on learning experience. The audience began to buzz with interest. This was better than they'd hoped for. Not only would they get to see primitive human panic behavior firsthand, but they'd have a living specimen demonstrate his own species' inferiority. It was like Christmas morning, if Christmas morning involved intellectual superiority and academic validation. Professor Velcron practically vibrated with anticipation. This is highly irregular, but I suppose for the sake of science. Great, Jake said, standing up with the casual confidence of someone who definitely had a plan. I'll need the lights dimmed about halfway, and if possible, access to the building's environmental controls. Temperature, humidity, air circulation, that sort of thing. Oh, and can someone patch me into the sound system? Environmental controls, Quillax asked, sounding puzzled. Why would you need those for a fear demonstration? Jake's grin widened just a fraction. Trust me, you want the full authentic experience, right? 10 minutes later, the amphitheater had been transformed into what could charitably be called atmospheric, and less charitably be called, why did we agree to this? The lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow that cast strange shadows across the curved walls. Jake had somehow convinced the building's AI to grant him temporary access to environmental controls, which should have been the first red flag, but academic curiosity had overridden common sense. Jake stood at the center of the amphitheater, hands clasped behind his back, looking for all the world like he was about to give a presentation on quarterly sales figures, rather than demonstrate primitive fear responses. So, he began conversationally, anybody here ever been camping? The audience exchanged glances. Several beings made noises that might have been laughter or possibly digestive issues. Right, of course not. Different evolutionary paths and all that, Jake nodded sagely. Well, humans have this tradition. We go out into the wilderness, sit around fires, and tell each other stories designed to scare the living daylights out of each other. We call them campfire stories. Professor Velcron leaned forward eagerly. Ah yes, primitive tribal bonding through shared fear stimulation. Please, continue. Thanks, Prof. Jake's tone was so dry it could have been used for kindling. This is a classic. It's called The Thing in the Walls. As he spoke, the temperature in the room began to drop, just a degree or two at first. Nothing noticeable to beings focused on watching the human make a fool of himself. Once upon a time, Jake began, and his voice had taken on a different quality. Still casual, but with something underneath it that seemed to resonate in the dimmed space. There was a research facility. A lot like this one, actually. Full of brilliant scientists from different species, all working together to understand the universe. A few beings nodded appreciatively. This sounded appropriately academic. But this facility had a problem, Jake continued, and now the air circulation system began to whisper softly through the vents. They'd been studying fear responses in various species, recording their reactions, cataloging their weaknesses, mapping their psychological breaking points. Very thorough work. The temperature dropped another degree. Someone in the front row pulled their appendages closer to their body. The researchers thought they were so clever, so advanced. They'd moved beyond primitive emotions, you see. Fear was just something to be studied, not experienced. Jake began walking slowly around the center of the amphitheater, his footsteps echoing in the modified acoustics. But here's the thing about studying fear. Sometimes it studies you back. The lights flickered once. Brief enough that it might have been a coincidence, except Jake didn't seem surprised by it at all. The first sign was the scratching, Jake said, and right on cue a soft scratching sound began emanating from the walls. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of sound that made you wonder if something was moving behind the panels. Just at night, at first. Security dismissed it as the building settling. Old facilities make noise, they said. Several beings were now looking around the amphitheater, with expressions that weren't quite as confident as they'd been 5 minutes ago. But then the researchers started having dreams, Jake continued, his voice dropping to just above a whisper, which somehow made it carry even better in the modified acoustics. Dreams about being watched, studied, catalogued. The scratching sound grew slightly louder, and now it seemed to be coming from multiple locations. The Zephyrone named Quillax was definitely looking uncomfortable. And that's when they realized, Jake said, pausing for effect as the temperature dropped another degree, that when you spend long enough studying something, eventually you become the thing being studied. The scratching stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. Jake let it stretch for exactly 7 seconds, long enough for the audience to notice the absence, before continuing. Now, I know what you're thinking, he said, and his tone was still conversational, still friendly, but there was something predatory creeping into it now. You're thinking, this is just a simple story. Humans tell stories because they're primitive. But see, that's where you've got it backwards. He stopped walking and faced Professor Velcron directly. Humans don't tell stories because we're primitive. We tell stories because we're apex psychological predators. The lights dimmed another notch, and now the amber glow was barely enough to make out faces in the crowd. Several beings were shifting uncomfortably, but they weren't sure why. It was just a story, after all, just words. Take you, for instance, Professor, Jake continued, and Velcron's throat sac constricted involuntarily. Your species, the Kethmori, evolved on a world with binary stars. Never really experienced true darkness, did you? Always some light in the sky. That's why your people developed those beautiful crystalline throat sacs, isn't it? They refract available light for communication. Velcron's 6 eyes widened simultaneously. Jake wasn't supposed to know that level of detail about Kethmori evolution. That was specialized xenobiology, not general knowledge. But here's what's interesting, Jake said, taking a step closer to the professor's podium. When Kethmori are placed in complete darkness, their throat sacs actually become a liability. They can't regulate the refraction properly. The light patterns become chaotic, disorienting. It's like having a strobe light attached to your neck that you can't control. As if on cue, the lights flickered again, and this time they stayed dimmer. Velcron's throat sac pulsed erratically, casting wild, dancing shadows across his face. And Quillax, Jake said, turning to the Zephyrin who had asked the earlier question. Your people are fascinating. Evolved from hive creatures, didn't you? Still have those vestigial pheromone receptors. Usually they're dormant in modern Zephyrins, but extreme stress can reactivate them. When that happens, you start picking up fear scents from other species. Psychological feedback loop. Gets worse and worse until you're basically drowning in everyone else's terror. The air circulation system had been gradually increasing, and now it was strong enough to carry sense throughout the amphitheater. Quillax's sensory fronds began twitching uncontrollably. How do you know this? Velcron demanded, but his voice cracked on the last word as his throat sac sent another burst of chaotic light across the room. Oh, I've been doing my homework, Jake replied cheerfully. See? That's another thing about humans. We're really, really good at pattern recognition and preparation. I've been auditing classes here for 3 months, Professor. 3 months of studying each and every species in this room. The temperature had now dropped a full 10 degrees. The scratching sounds returned, but now they seemed to be following a pattern, moving around the room in a slow circle. Several beings were looking over their shoulders, trying to locate the source. The Nexari near the door, Jake continued, gesturing casually toward a group of insectoid beings. You folks are claustrophobes by nature. Open spaces feel safe because you can see threats coming. But when visibility drops and escape routes become unclear, you get aggressive. Fight or flight kicks in hard. Except for you, it's mostly fight. Your mandibles are already starting to click, aren't they? Indeed, a soft clicking sound was now audible from that section of the amphitheater, growing more rapid by the minute. The Vorthon delegates in Section C, you're aquatic breathers. This dry air is already making you uncomfortable, but when your stress levels spike, your gills start working overtime. Pretty soon you're going to feel like you're suffocating in atmosphere you normally handle just fine. Wet, gasping sounds began emanating from Section C. And the beautiful crystallines down front, Jake said, his voice now carrying clearly through the modified acoustics despite speaking barely above a whisper. You perceive reality through harmonic resonance. But when sound becomes unpredictable, when the harmonics get chaotic, your entire sensory world starts breaking down. Reality itself becomes unreliable. As he spoke, subtle, discordant notes began weaving through the air circulation system's whisper. Nothing obvious, just enough to make the harmonic-sensitive beings feel like the world was becoming fundamentally wrong. Stop this immediately, Professor Velcron commanded, but his authority was somewhat undermined by the fact that his throat sac was now strobing like a broken beacon, and his voice was shaking. But we're just getting to the good part, Jake said, and now his smile was visible, even in the dimmed light, because it was the kind of smile that seemed to generate its own illumination. See? All of you have been sitting here for 47 minutes, listening to a lecture about how primitive human fear responses are, but you know what you haven't been doing? The scratching sounds suddenly stopped, the temperature stabilized, even the discordant harmonics faded. In the sudden silence, Jake's voice carried with perfect clarity. You haven't been paying attention to your own. The silence that followed was deafening, not because there was no sound, but because every being in that amphitheater was suddenly, acutely aware of their own breathing, their own heartbeat equivalents, their own involuntary stress responses that they'd been so smugly dismissing as primitive just an hour ago. You see, Jake continued, beginning to pace again, but now his movements seemed different, more deliberate, like a predator who'd been patiently waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. The thing about human fear responses isn't that they're primitive, It's that we've learned to use them as tools. The building's AI chose that moment to announce in a cheerful automated voice, "Environmental system malfunction detected. Please remain calm while we investigate." Several beings jumped at the announcement. Jake didn't even blink. "Whoops," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "Looks like something's wrong with the building systems. Hope that doesn't mean we're locked in here or anything." As if on cue, the soft sound of magnetic locks engaging echoed through the amphitheater. The exit doors sealed with a series of decisive clicks. "Jake," Professor Velcron said, and his voice was now openly shaking. "What have you done?" "Me? Nothing much, just a little demonstration of human creativity." Jake pulled out his tablet and tapped it casually. "See, while you were all preparing your lectures on primitive fear responses, I was learning about advanced computer systems. Turns out, when you're an exchange student, they give you access to a lot of educational resources, including the building's maintenance protocols." The lights flickered again, but this time they stayed off for a full 3 seconds before returning to that eerie amber glow. In the darkness, something that might have been laughter echoed from the walls. "That's not possible," Quillex gasped, her pheromone receptors now fully active and flooding her system with the terror sense of 46 other panicking species. "The building's AI has multiple security layers." "Oh, absolutely," Jake agreed. "Really impressive security. Took me almost 2 weeks to find all the back doors. Did you know that if you classify something as a psychological research experiment and get the right academic approval codes, you can override almost any safety protocol?" "Thanks for signing off on that, by the way, Professor." Velcron's throat sac was now strobing so rapidly it was giving everyone in the vicinity a headache. "I never signed any approval codes." "Check your message queue from last Tuesday," Jake suggested helpfully. "Right after your morning lecture on exploiting psychological vulnerabilities in lesser species. Great title, by the way. Really inspiring stuff." The scratching sounds returned, but now they were accompanied by something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to be walking through the walls themselves, circling the trapped audience like a shark circling bleeding prey. "The beautiful thing about humans," Jake continued, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the increasing panic sounds from the audience, "is that we don't just survive fear. We domesticate it. We breed it. We turn it into entertainment, into art, into weapons." The Nexari by the doors were now actively trying to claw their way out, their mandibles clicking in rapid distress patterns. The crystallines were huddled together, their harmonic senses completely overwhelmed by the discordant chaos Jake had woven into the building's systems. "We're the only species in known galactic history that voluntarily frightens itself for fun," Jake said, his voice cutting through the growing pandemonium with unnatural clarity. "Horror movies, haunted houses, extreme sports. We're so comfortable with fear that we've turned terror into a recreational activity." The temperature began dropping again, but faster this time. The Vorthon delegates were now gasping openly, their gills working overtime as panic made the dry air even harder to process. "But here's the really interesting part," Jake continued, seemingly oblivious to the chaos surrounding him. "The reason we can weaponize fear so effectively isn't because we don't feel it. It's because we feel it constantly, and we've learned to function anyway." The footsteps in the walls stopped directly behind Professor Velcron's podium. Everyone could hear them, but there was nowhere for them to be coming from. The wall was solid metal and composite materials. "Human children," Jake said, his voice dropping to that same conversational whisper that somehow carried perfectly, "are afraid of monsters under the bed, things in closets, sounds in the dark. And you know what human parents tell them?" The building's lights went out completely. Emergency lighting should have kicked in immediately, but somehow it didn't. The only illumination came from Velcron's wildly strobing throat sac and the faint bioluminescence of a few panicked species. In the darkness, Jake's voice continued, and now it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. "We tell them that monsters aren't real, but we also teach them that even if monsters were real, humans are scarier." A new sound began to emanate from the walls, not scratching this time, but something that sounded disturbingly like breathing. Slow, deep, patient breathing from something very large. "You want to know the real difference between humans and every other species in this room?" Jake asked, and now his voice was definitely coming from multiple directions, as if the building itself was speaking. "You've spent millions of years of evolution trying to eliminate fear from your psychology. We've spent millions of years learning to use it as fuel." Professor Velcron was now openly whimpering, his 6 eyes darting frantically around the darkness. "Please," he gasped. "Stop this. We understand. We were wrong about humans. Oh, but Professor, Jake's voice replied, and now it sounded like it was coming from directly behind every single being in the amphitheater simultaneously. The demonstration isn't over yet. The breathing sound from the walls suddenly stopped. And in the perfect silence that followed, every being in that room realized they were holding their breath, waiting for whatever came next. The lights came back on. Not gradually, not with any dramatic flare, they just clicked on. Full brightness, flooding the amphitheater with normal, boring, academic illumination. The temperature immediately began returning to standard classroom levels. The air circulation system settled back into its usual quiet hum. The scratching sounds, the footsteps, the breathing, all of it simply stopped. Jake Martinez stood exactly where he'd been standing when the demonstration began, hands clasped behind his back, looking like he'd just finished explaining the quarterly budget, rather than psychologically terrorizing an entire auditorium full of allegedly superior beings. And that, he said in the same conversational tone he'd used to start his campfire story, is a human fear response demonstration. The silence that followed was different from the terrified silence of moments before. This was the silence of 47 different species trying to process what had just happened to them, trying to reconcile the fact that they were all still alive, still safe, still sitting in a perfectly normal lecture hall with the absolute certainty they'd all felt moments before, that something terrible was about to devour them. Professor Velcron's throat sac was still pulsing erratically, casting rainbow patterns across his desk. "How?" he managed to croak. "How did you do that?" "Simple psychology and environmental manipulation," Jake replied, pulling out his tablet and tapping through a few screens. "Humans figured out a long time ago that fear isn't just about what's actually there. It's about what might be there, what could be there, what your brain convinces you is there." He gestured around the amphitheater, which now looked exactly like it had at the beginning of class. Normal lighting, normal temperature, normal sounds. I didn't actually change much, physically speaking. Dropped the temperature 10 degrees, modified the lighting, played some pre-recorded sounds through the air circulation system, and took advantage of some very minor security vulnerabilities to control the door locks and make some announcements. "The footsteps," Quillax whispered, her sensory fronds still twitching. "The breathing, it sounded like something was in the walls." "Acoustic illusion," Jake explained patiently. "Humans have been using sound to create psychological effects for thousands of years. Surround sound, spatial audio, frequency manipulation. Amazing what you can do with a building's existing speaker system if you know which harmonics to use." He swiped across his tablet, and suddenly his voice was coming from the left wall, then the right, then from directly behind Professor Velcron. Directional audio isn't exactly cutting-edge technology, but when you're already primed to be afraid, your brain fills in the gaps. The crystallines were slowly uncurling from their protective huddles, their harmonic senses readjusting to the normal acoustic environment. One of them managed to speak, her voice resonating with confused overtones. "But the building's AI, the system malfunctions." "Oh, those were real," Jake admitted cheerfully. "I did actually hack the building's systems, but not in any dangerous way. I just triggered some diagnostic routines and temporarily disabled the emergency lighting. The magnetic door locks were never actually engaged, by the way. That was just a sound effect." He walked over to the nearest exit and pushed the door open easily. Several Nexari scrambled toward it immediately, then stopped, looking embarrassed. "The real trick," Jake continued, letting the door swing shut again, "wasn't technological. It was psychological. See, I spent 3 months studying each of your species. Not just the basic stuff you learn in Xenobiology 101, but the deep cultural and evolutionary psychology. Your fears, your triggers, your biological vulnerabilities." He gestured toward Professor Velcron. "Kethmori really do have problems with chaotic light patterns. Zephyrians really can reactivate dormant pheromone receptors under extreme stress. Nexari really are claustrophobic. All of that was true. But you didn't actually trigger those responses," Velcron said slowly, his throat sac finally beginning to stabilize. "You just made us think you had." "Exactly." Jake's smile was genuinely warm now, not predatory at all. "I gave you just enough real stimuli to make your brains do the rest of the work. That's the thing about fear, Professor. It's not actually about external threats. It's about internal perception of external threats." He tucked his tablet away and picked up his bag from his seat. "Humans didn't evolve beyond fear responses like you suggested in your lecture. We evolved to understand them, to manipulate them, to use them as tools. We invented horror entertainment not because we're primitive, but because we're the only species that figured out how to safely practice being afraid. We tell scary stories around campfires because narrative fear is how we train our brains to handle real fear. Jake slung his bag over his shoulder and started walking toward the exit. Every human child grows up learning that the monster under the bed isn't real, but the fear of the monster is, and more importantly, that humans are really, really good at creating monsters when we need to. He paused at the door and looked back at the still stunned audience. The real lesson here isn't about fear responses, Professor. It's about assumption responses. You assumed that because human reactions are emotional, they must be primitive. But emotional doesn't mean stupid. It just means we've learned to use a wider range of tools. Professor Velcron found his voice again. What are you taking next semester? Jake's grin was back, but now it just looked like a regular college student who was pleased with his academic performance. Interspecies psychology, advanced xenobiology, and creative writing. Turns out there's a lot of overlap between those subjects. He pushed open the door, letting normal hallway sounds drift into the amphitheater. The sound of students chatting, footsteps on floors, the ordinary bustle of academic life. Reality, in other words. Oh, and Professor, Jake called back over his shoulder, for your next lecture, you might want to consider the topic, Why Humans Invented Horror Movies for Fun. I think it would be very educational. The door swung shut behind him, leaving 47 species of allegedly superior beings to contemplate the fact that they'd just been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and thoroughly educated by a member of the species they'd been mocking for being primitively emotional. And somewhere in the back of their minds, most of them were already wondering what else humans might be capable of when they really put their minds to it.